Hello and welcome to the Jewish Holocaust Centre's public programs. I'm Anna Hirsch, Manager of Collections and Research, and it is an honour to introduce Halina Strnad in conversation with her good friend, Dr. John Rogers. One of the last trials of Nazi war criminals was held last year. Some question why these elderly men and women should be taken through the justice system at such an advanced age. In early 2020, Bruno, former SS guard at Stutthof concentration camp, went on trial for war crimes at the Children's Court in Hamburg. Witnesses appeared via video link from across the world. Halina Strnad presented her testimony, the only witness from Australia. In this presentation, Dr. John Rogers interviews Halina, and she talks openly about personal and witnessed events during the Holocaust, her participation in the trial, and reflections in its aftermath. As one who experienced the crimes and cruelty of Nazism, Halina's views on justice and forgiveness in this presentation are vital contributions. I'd like to end on a quote by Nazi hunter Ephraim Zuroff, who concisely stated, "The passage of time in no way diminishes the guilt of perpetrators. Had they been prosecuted immediately after they committed the crimes, it would only have been natural, but the fact that they had eluded justice for decades does not in any way reduce their guilt." Thank you for joining us.
Allow me to introduce myself. I am John Rogers. I was born in Melbourne. My mother was born in Geelong, and my father arrived from Lodz in Poland in 1925. He managed to bring the rest of his family to Australia before the Second World War. Many relatives were left behind in Poland, and many were murdered in the Holocaust. I graduated in 1965 from Melbourne University in medicine. I first worked as a resident at the Alfred Hospital, where I met Halina. I worked for 2 years at the Alfred, and then I moved to the Children's Hospital to train in paediatrics. Ultimately, I trained in medical genetics in the USA and became eventually the director of the Medical Genetics Service at the Royal Children's Hospital. In 1989, following an illness, I retrained as a psychotherapist, and I practiced in that field for over 20 years. I've had a long-term interest in the Holocaust since reading Lord Russell's book, The Scourge of the Swastika, when I was a young teenager. I became friendly with Halina when I worked in her department at the Alfred Hospital. We lost track of each other when she moved to Dorevitch Pathology. I recontacted her after finding her name in a list of donors to the Holocaust Museum in the Holocaust Centre News. We've maintained regular contact since that time, and I feel very privileged to have this chance of interviewing Halina. Now, Halina, no introduction I can give will do you justice.
Oh.
Justice to the extraordinary person that you are. Halina's own words provide a much better picture. She has given testimony to the Shoah Foundation under quite difficult circumstances with an interviewer and this can be found on YouTube. Halina has written 2 books. The first was People and Places, which was published by the Maycor Library, and the second was Testimony, published by Hardy Grant. This book, in addition to outlining Halina's Holocaust experience, also tells of her time back in Poland after the war, and her experience as a migrant coming to Melbourne, where she graduated from Melbourne University and took up a job in the pathology department at the Alfred Hospital. She worked there for 16 years before moving
23.
23 years before moving to Abe Dorovich's laboratory for the remainder of her working life. In addition, she was a passionate member of the Humanist Society and held executive roles. She wrote many of the submissions that the Society made. She was also a member of Gun Control Australia. Halina was born in 1930. When war broke out, the family were incarcerated in the Lodge Ghetto, from where the family were transported to Auschwitz. Her father, Joseph, was separated on arrival, and she never saw him again. In July 1944, Halina and her mother were transported to Stutthof. Unfortunately, her mother tragically did not survive. A guard from that camp, Bruno Day, has recently been put on trial in Hamburg. This interview is primarily about that trial, in which Bruno Day was ultimately found guilty, and Halina's testimony played a major part in that. I plan to ask a series of questions and have Halina respond without much further input from me. So it's good to see you this morning, Halina.
Same here.
I'm aware from spending time with you over the years of the burden you experience in testifying and the fact you regard it as an obligation. I was wondering if you could tell us how you became involved in the trial of Bruno Day.
Well, it is an obligation. In the camps, we kept saying, if we survive, we shall have to testify until we die. And I'm meeting that obligation and have on many occasions after the war. I testified to many research bodies and finally wrote a book. How I got involved into Bruno Day was that I received a letter from a German lawyer in August 2019 informing me that a trial of a former guard was pending, and as a survivor of Stutthof, which he found through my book amazingly, he informed me that I am entitled to act as a co-plaintiff in that trial and urged me to do so. He already represented several other survivors, mainly males from Poland who were incarcerated for being freedom fighters. I accepted the offer, gave him a power of attorney to represent me, and then received a document from him, which I need to read to you. German prosecutors charge a 92-year-old man with aiding and abetting murder of 5,230 people as a guard in Nazi concentration camp during World War II. He was identified as Bruno Day, D-E-Y, and despite his senior age, the accused will be tried by a juvenile court in Hamburg because he was 16 when he first worked in Stutthof. So that was the announcement telling me what the trial is all about.
Do you know how he was identified as a war criminal?
No, I don't know. The German police found him. There were apparently copious records found in Stutthof when it was liberated, stating every single thing that happened there. He never denied that he was a guard there, but he claimed that he had no option once the SS sent him there.
And once it began, what involvement and what sort of support and help did you receive from other people?
Well, before that, two officers from Australian Federal Police turned up on my doorstep unannounced, identified themselves, walked in, a male and a female, sat down and informed me that the German police approached them and asked them to set up a video link at their headquarters and organize me to testify through that video link on the 28th of January. This was early in January 2020. See that I, for 3 hours, since 8 o'clock till 11 o'clock at night, to meet the German morning session. I meant to tell you that doctors declared Bruno Day fit to stand trial, but only in 3-hour sessions, 2 or 3 days apart. And that session was to be my testimony. One of those two officers, I'll call him Mr. Smith, it's not his name, but just in case confidentiality is regarded, was particularly nice. He asked me if it'll be traumatic for me and is there any way he could make it easier. A total stranger who just walked in. It was very good to have people like that. At that time, I knew that my friends who offered to be with me there and hold my hand for moral support would not be allowed, because in juvenile courts, the public is not allowed, only journalists and observers. So I said, Mr. Smith, if you could just stay in the room out of camera range so that I don't feel entirely alone in the room. And he said, I'll most certainly do that. Yeah. So that was helpful. A couple of days after they left, I received a phone call from my lawyer in Germany telling me that he just was given permission to come to Australia to represent me personally, which was marvellous. Yeah. He sounded so nice. And he was enormously helpful as well.
So, could you tell us what happened the day before
on the day of my testimony? The lawyer, I'll call him Raymond, that's his first name. By the way, Mr. Smith, Raymond and I, probably because we shared an emotional event, bonded in such a way that we talked as old friends, lifelong friends. There was just nitty-gritties, and it was amazing how he bonded. He arrived the previous afternoon, booked in a hotel in the city, and came to my place in the morning of the 28th of January. He told me what happened in the trial at that until then, when others. Bruno Day claimed that he knew that Jews were being killed who haven't committed any crime, but that was because Hitler wanted to get rid of the tribe, was his choice of word. That he hadn't harmed anyone personally, but the prosecution said that armed with a machine gun, he prevented our escape. He and rebellion, and ushered hundreds and hundreds of people into gas chambers and gas wagons, and therefore he was involved in the running of the Stutthof killing machine. He claimed that he had no option once he was seconded, which was contradicted by a German historian who showed that several guards in Stutthof asked to be transferred to the army and were sent to the Russian front. But of course it was safer to be in the camp at that time. Raymond gave me a 82-page indictment of Bruno Day, a copy of which I donated to this centre.
Yeah.
In it, there is a detailed and gruesome description of the methods of killing used in Stutthof. And I would like to read you the names of the categories.
Okay.
They were categorized. 1, killings by gassing.
Yes.
2, killings by shots in the back of the neck. There was a special arrangement. Killings by plagues and epidemics. We had typhus introduced. Killing by gas wagon. Killings by living conditions which were described either as hostile or incompatible with life. So that was the information I got from Raymond. I asked him what the defense is likely to ask me. He thought they might likely to find discrepancies in my statements. At 7 o'clock, Mr. Smith arrived and picked us both and took us to their headquarters, where on the second floor there was the video link was arranged.
Mm-hmm. And what was the process once you were connected on the video link?
Raymond and I sat at a table. We had a microphone and a camera in front of us, and on the wall was a large screen on which I could see the judge, a lady in her mid-40s, and another lady acting as an interpreter next to her. Mm-hmm. That's all we could see.
And were you cross-examined or challenged at all?
Oh, I was asked quite a few questions.
Yeah.
I could focus and answer them. I stated that when we arrived in Stutthof, it was after 5 years of incarceration, hunger, physical and mental abuse, and we were in a poor state. My recollections of Stutthof are a mixture of very clear memory of events and many blurred ones. It was important to me to say that. I was asked whether I remember the number allotted to me on entrance to Stutthof, and I did. I said it was 84,065, and the judge said, correct, that's what we have in the records. That was amazing. And my mother's number, who was one in front of me, was 84,064, and that was confirmed. I said that I was beaten, kicked and spat upon. I was called verfluchter Schwein, Scheiße and shit, festering pig, shit and subhuman, Untermensch. Was the guard able to see what was happening? I said, absolutely. He was up on his tower witnessing the frequent public hangings. An assembly whistle would get us all out of our barracks, and we had to stand and watch a series of public hangings, mostly Russian POWs.
Could you see Bruno Day during your testimony?
Not at all. I could only see the judge and the translator. But later I was shown that in various pictures that I couldn't see his face because he permanently hid it behind a folder.
What happened when you finished your testimony?
I haven't yet finished. I had a lot to say, which I would like to record. I reported an incident, which I record very well, when one of the there was a group of sadistic female guards, and one was ushering high-ranking officers around the camp. I happened to be near the door of the barracks when she opened it and said, "Da haben wir unsere Untermenschen. Here we keep our subhumans." And they covered their faces in handkerchief and walked away because we stank so much. I describe an incident where a newcomer to the camp gave birth to a stillborn baby, and we had to break a window to get a piece of glass to cut the umbilical cord. In spite of efforts of 2 doctors among the inmates, she died of blood loss. There was no way of stemming her torrential bleed. I was given the job to get rid of the baby's body. I took it to the latrine and pushed it well down with a wooden plank under the excreta. 2 or 3 days later, the bloated body was seen floating on top of the latrine, and it appeared in my nightmares for many years. I recalled one of the many public hangings where one young guy on the way up to the gallows started singing the Russian national anthem in a beautiful tenor voice, and he sang until he slumped in the nurse, and he also visited my nightmares for years. I described the behavior of the particularly cruel camp commandant who visited from time to time and kicked and fractured my nose, broke my nose and fractured skull, which required corrective surgery after the war. And what happened at the end of it?
What happened after you'd given all of this testimony?
I wanted the judge turned to the court and said, "Is there anyone wishing to interrogate this witness?" And to my surprise, the defense declined the offer. I wasn't interrogated. Raymond thought it was because they were afraid I'll sink him even further.
Digging themselves in even deeper.
But I want to tell you another moment. Halfway through the 3 hours, we had a 15-minute break. Mr. Smith, who stayed in the room for the whole 3 hours, as he promised, and a couple of others that were on duty at that late night, rushed in, asked me, do I want refreshments, tea, coffee? Was the chair I was sitting comfortable enough? Total strangers.
Yeah.
And Raymond kept telling me that I was doing well, which was great help. And at that moment, it occurred to me that I am receiving the best of human nature while I'm testifying about the worst. It just struck me as a contrast.
Right.
About 11 o'clock, it was finished, and we were about to leave the building with Mr. Smith taking me and Raymond to our respective homes, when he got a call that the judge wants to see us. We traipsed back on the second floor, set up the video link, and there was the judge on her own, standing rather than sitting, and I stood there. In very good English, she said to me, on my behalf and on behalf of the court, I want to thank you very much for your very important testimony. We were aware how difficult it might. I stood there completely stunned, thinking, how on earth can I respond to this? When I was given a question, I concentrated on that. But this was unexpected. And I stood there like an idiot. Fortunately, she carried on, and I gathered my wits, and I said, testifying is an obligation, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify. Those two guys in the corner, Raymond, Mr. Smith, was very pleased and sent me a signal like that. Then Mr. Smith took me home. It was about midnight. On the way, he told us that he was seconded to another section of the police, which was actually a promotion, but asked to defer it because he wanted to see through the case he was on, which was my case. That's how nice
Remarkable.
people were to me.
Mm-hmm. And I know after you gave your testimony, we talked, and you felt that you needed to be on your own for a little while. How do you feel after you've testified?
I was absolutely exhausted, emotionally and physically, and I took a sleeping tablet because I knew that the night will be hopeless. But that's what happens when you testify for several days. It's all back there in front of your mind, and it takes several days to push it into the back of your mind where it normally sits. So I was used to it, but Raymond was so pleased with my contribution, and the judge obviously was, so I thought perhaps I've done well.
Yes, indeed. And that was borne out in the judgment that was written.
Well, in the judgment, I was mentioned as an important witness. One of the participants, observers, was Dr. Ephraim
Zuroff.
From Simon Wiesenthal Center. Dr. Ephraim Zuroff, who wrote a glowing article published 2 days later in Israeli Times of Israel on January 30th, and said some very nice things about me. Halina described her life in Stutthof in graphic detail. The conditions of time was terrible, and he summarizes what I said. But said, Halina Strnad's testimony was incredibly powerful and clearly moved the judge as well as the journalists and spectators in the courtroom. But I want to show you something else. Then he says, she and her parents were among the last Jews deported. For reasons she did not explain, she and her mother were sent by a cattle car to Stutthof, as if I knew.
As to why they...
Underlying this statement is the belief that the commanders in Auschwitz talked to us, informed us of where we're going and why. What happened was we were ushered into cattle trains, pushed into, squashed like sardines, and went without the slightest idea where to, let alone why.
Yes.
People who were not there cannot imagine the settings and always either ask or make statements that are frankly ridiculous. I am told that I am describing unimaginable things, and therefore I should not expect people to imagine and ask sensible questions. Well,
That's certainly true. What in the end do you think the whole trial achieved?
Well, I think it achieved a lot, John. For me, it was all about publicity. I couldn't care what happened to Bruno Day, but I wanted publicity to remind the young people what happened 3 generations ago, lest we forget.
Yes.
Particularly important now in view of the rise of white supremacism, neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism. And it did receive wide publicity, not just Germany, but throughout Europe, perhaps because it's one or the last of such trials.
Yeah.
So Raymond assured me and showed me that every newspaper thing, even here, this was mentioned in the media.
Also reported in the Washington Post and New York Times, where I read it.
Everywhere. That's what I wanted, so I've achieved that. On the personal level, it was gratifying. The judge thought I did well. Mr. Zurov wrote a glowing article about it. Raymond thought I was very good and wrote me a letter after the sentence that my testimony was very important. The judge in her sentencing statement mentioned me, so I think I've done something important and well. So on the personal level it was gratifying, but it was the publicity that
Is really so important.
Yes.
Yes. Surviving the Lodge, ghetto, Auschwitz and Stutthof concentration camp was extraordinary. What do you think contributed to your survival?
Well, first of all, my parents' insistence in the labour camp that I eat part of their meagre food rations, a source of guilt to this day, because I was growing rapidly. That increased my chances of survival and diminished theirs. My ability to regress to a primitive state where I focused all my tiny wits on survival, interpreting sounds and silences and movements all in terms of approaching danger, rather like a small creature living in the underground growth of a jungle surrounded by predators.
Yeah.
I was totally focused on survival. And I believe that gave me an advantage in the stakes of survival over those whose highly developed intellect made it difficult to become so regressive, such a primitive state. I can't prove it, but I observed that in the camps. I befriended a lady who was a professor of, I believe, sociology, not something I could understand that. And she was forever philosopher. I'd say, be careful, we have this trigger-happy guard on duty today, and she would say, I was just wondering how humankind will view these events in retrospect, or how Dante would have written his Inferno had he been through Stutthof. Not that I had a clue who Dante was. At the time I was exasperated. I thought, she's not stupid. Why can't she see that in this setting you have to be on guard all the time And all this philosophizing and reflecting keeps you off guard. It took years of growing up after the war to realize that from a height of such developed intellect, where you have wide horizons and where you can see the big picture, you couldn't regress
To those.
to primitive state that I could.
Yeah.
Other than that, people were helping. There was a German civilian when I left Stutthof on a march, death march, that found us, me, myself and two others, hiding in an overturned railway wagon and delivered food for 3 or more weeks. We would have perished without that until the Russian army arrived. And then there was the Russian soldier who picked me up, semi-conscious, and took me to his unit where the doctor resuscitated me. Throughout all this, sheer chance and luck defined your survival. It was the rapidly changing, unpredictable conditions. It's beautifully described in a poem written by a Polish laureate poet, Wisława Szymborska, and I would like to read you a section of her poem. You were saved because you were the first. You were saved because you were the last, alone with others. On the right, the left. Because it was raining, because of the shade. You were in luck. There was a forest. You were in luck. A rake, a hook, a beam, a brake, a quarter inch, an instant. So you are here. Mm. One hole in the net and you slipped through.
Yeah.
And that's so very true.
Describes just how remarkable and how much chance played a
sheer
role.
luck, a split second, a step in the right or wrong direction that decided your survival in those settings.
And do you think the fact that you were a child or adolescent at the time you were there had made a difference?
Well, yes, I think that not being able to see the big picture, and as I said, focusing entirely all my tiny wits on survival was a help.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the war, I was quite an accomplished prisoner. I had tricks of survival. I was good at pretending to be dead. That helped in several occasions. But when the war broke out, I had to learn to live a normal life. Suddenly there were choices and options, and I had to make decisions. That was new.
Yeah.
Time management. People said, what are you doing this afternoon? I haven't decided what I do in 10 minutes. I still lived in the moment because it was pointless.
Yeah.
Money management, shopping, making the slightest meal was a problem. I had to learn to lead a life of normal people. I was fortunate. I was a minor and therefore had to have legal guardians, and very nice people offered to be my legal guardians, and they were wise and helpful in my learning to lead a normal life.
Mm. What work were you forced to do when you were in Auschwitz, and also were you forced to work in Stutthof?
In Auschwitz, I was often picked out of naked parades, perhaps because I was a bit less skeletal than others. And we were forced to put large planks of wood over the swampy ground so the trucks wouldn't get bogged in. For several weeks, we had to load bodies delivered from gas chambers into the crematoria oven and then carry buckets of ashes to reclaim the swampy ground. And the ashes contained teeth and dentures and bits, fragments of bones that weren't burned. In Stutthof, there were no allotted jobs, but every morning we had to carry out the bodies of those who died overnight and pile them up outside the barrack to be collected by male inmates who were pushing and pulling a wooden tray. Sometimes the pile was so high that 2 or 3 of us were ordered to help the loading on it. Several of the male inmates were harnessed to the tray like horses.
Mm. You've said, when we've talked in the past, and also in your writing, that Stutthof was worse than Auschwitz. In what sort of way?
Absolutely. We called it the bottom of hell.
Mm-hmm.
In Auschwitz, we slept in bunks. In Stutthof was the floor. Initially, we were so overcrowded that we couldn't even stretch our legs. Soon so many died that there was more room. In Auschwitz, there was some primitive arrangements for toilets involving buckets and seats. In Stutthof was a latrine, a big hole in the ground, soon had slippery edges with the danger of falling in. Initially, it was surrounded by a wooden fence. When I got there, it was broken in several places, and there was loose planks of wood which we used to prevent ourselves slipping in. Mm-hmm. There was a team of particularly sadistic female guards in my section of Stutthof. Stutthof had several different sections, each with its own arrangements and treatments. I was in the Jewish women section, which is listed under the conditions hostile to life and introduced epidemic. We, I think the beginning of January 1945, that within 2 days we were all down with typhus. That's not the normal way epidemic spreads. No. And very few survived that. My mother didn't.
Yeah, yes. What effect do you think all those years of deprivation that you went through had on you and the other people that were there?
Well, the obvious physical deprivation. I was treated for tuberculosis after the war. Prolonged malnutrition has health effects. It was such a sledgehammer. It reshaped your values and your attitudes. I doubt it was possible to emerge unchanged mentally in any way.
Yeah.
But there was another level of deprivation I would like to mention, which isn't often stated, and that is total deprivation of any aesthetic experiences. Try, it's hard, but please try. Imagine nearly 6 years without a book or music or a garden or a flower or a pleasant view or a beautiful picture, and plenty of the opposite, ugliness, stench and dirt. I've come to think that such prolonged deprivation of that kind has a brutalizing effect. We were brutalized to the extent where our language deteriorated to angry single monosyllables. We swore a lot. All social graces disappeared. Words like please and thank you was totally incongruous in that particular setting. Mm-hmm. I've come to think that the need for beauty is an important part of being a normal human being. And after the war, I sought and was keen to. But look at us. We decorate our dwellings and ourselves. We travel to admire beauty of nature. We attend picture galleries, concert halls, ballet, parks, libraries, and take it all for granted. It's this prolonged deprivation that made me aware of things that enrich your life.
Yeah. And you've created a beautiful garden at home as well.
Well, yes, my contribution to the greening of Australia.
What thoughts do you have about collective responsibility?
That was a subject that erupted after the war, based on the statement that, quote, evil succeeds only when good people remain silent, end of quote. Well, I think that works in democracy. Having experienced two police states under Hitler and Stalin, I know that the slightest attempt of criticism or rebellion has such wide repercussions, often lethal, that I understand why good people stood silent, wanting to protect their families and friends from harm.
Yeah.
Behind barbed wires, the same things operated. We were told, don't you try this, we'll all hang for you, attempts of sabotage or something.
Yeah, yeah.
There, the obligation was not to cause mass reprisals. So people who talk about collective responsibility need to see that it operates only in democratic setups.
Yeah. How do you manage to avoid being a victim at this stage of your life?
Well, I've decided, I've overheard my mother saying to her neighbour in Stutthof, she wonders if this child survives, pointing at me, will she ever be normal? Mm-hmm. So the word normal, I wondered after the war, am I normal? My role models, my parents, and I made a special effort to be normal and not remain a victim. I have friends who, to this day, read every book and watched every documentary about the war. It dominates their lives. I decided early in the piece I will not do it. Testifying is an obligation. Going through this, researching it, reliving it, is not an obligation. I spoke to myself severely, said, don't do that, don't think like that, that's a victim, and I think I've succeeded. I was interviewed under the project in 1995, 50 years after the end of the war. It was entitled children survival, Holocaust survivors, scars left 50 years on. And I was interviewed at length, 3 long Sundays, by a psychologist, and she was looking for scars, mental obviously. And she asked about dozens of questions about my early childhood and the war and after the war. And in the end she said, "You've done well. I don't think there are many scars on you."
I would agree.
So pleased with that.
And finally, what do you feel about forgiveness?
Oh, not forgiveness. That's a question that crops up from time to time and is ridiculous. I do not feel entitled or qualified to forgive on behalf of the millions slaughtered and thousands maimed. It wasn't all about me.
Yeah, yes. It just remains for me to thank you, Halina, for allowing me the privilege of interviewing you. Thanks.
I'm glad it was you and not a stranger, and I'm glad I had another opportunity to testify.
Sometimes survivors' migration experiences are described as they came to Australia or somewhere else and started a new life, or they rebuilt their lives. But these phrases can seem to be too neat and tidy, compartmentalising their lives to a before and after. Survivors of oppression and atrocities were never freed of their experiences. Participating in this trial was significant to Halina. As she reiterates, we should testify until we die. Her contribution was also on behalf of those unable to bear witness. Thank you, Halina and John, for this important presentation, and thank you for joining us and for your continued support.